Well, good morning. We want to welcome Joni Biker, who is with us this morning. Joni holds a special place in our heart because she's a graduate of Unity Christian in 1999, also from Ireton Christian. When she was here, she was involved in a lot of different activities. One of those was softball. And she's going to talk a little bit about her story of her journey to where she's at now. Our connection with her is that this summer we also were able to see her over in Liberia and actually got to see where she was living. She got a great oceanside home, but the work that she's involved with there, very interesting. Now, one other connection we've had with Unity that we've had before, I believe there's at least a class, juniors or seniors, where we put some Samaritan's Purse shoeboxes together. And those are boxes that are sent around the world as a way of connecting with children and families and spreading the gospel. And so Joni works for Samaritan Purse, and she'll tell you a little bit about what she does with that organization. But it's a great organization. Franklin Graham started it and has used this ministry to really meet people's needs both physically and spiritually. So we're happy to have Joni here this morning, and just one thing that really strikes me about her is her love for the Lord and also just her heart for people. And so we welcome you this morning.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm happy to be here this morning. I think a good way to start off is to show you a picture. Uh-oh. Well, that's not good. Okay, that's good. Just a second here. Oh. Technical difficulties, I apologize. Okay, let's start this again. I thought a good way to start this off is to show you a picture of me 20 years ago when I was here at Unity. I was a senior 20 years ago. It's hard for me to believe that it's been that long. I had a lot of nicknames back then. One was Bikes, from my last name, Biker, but another one was Bob, which my friends affectionately called me Bag of Bones, as you can see in the picture. I was a very skinny kid. I'm no longer that skinny, and that's okay. I've grown into myself as we've gone along there. But as I sat in your seat 20 years ago, I had a lot of questions. What do I do? Seniors, I'm sure you're already sick of that question that people are asking you. So what are you going to do next year? It's hard to know what you're going to do. And I had no idea, really, what God had in store for me in the next 20 years. And so I want to share with you two experiences especially that if you would have told me 20 years ago that I'd be standing on this stage talking to the Unity student body, I'd probably believe you. That's believable. But if you would have told me what I'm going to share, I would have laughed in your face and said, no way, I don't believe it. But God had a perfect plan for me. You know, through high school, one of my favorite verses was Jeremiah 29:11, and I think a lot of us know that. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you, not to harm you, plans to give you a future and a hope. But a lot of times we make the plans that we want to see happen in our own lives, right? But I'm here to tell you, God has a greater plan and a greater purpose. So when I was in college, I ended up going to school for education. I really didn't know which area I wanted to go into. And I went into education. A lot of my friends were going into education, and I thought, well, maybe that's what I should do. And I started that degree, and I soon quickly realized that that was not what I should be doing. And so I went back to the passion that God had put in my heart as a little girl, and that was photography. He had placed this desire since I was really little to work in Africa, of all places. He just placed Africa on my heart. And so I started going after that. I went to photography school, and it was immediately obvious that that was exactly where I was supposed to be. And then in photography school, I just had this, it was really interesting. I'll never forget the first day of class. Everyone had to stand in front of the class. They had to show 3 examples of pictures that they had taken, and you had to share what you wanted to do with your photography. Every person stood up there and said, I want to be a wedding photographer. I want to be a commercial photographer and make tons of money. I want to, be a photojournalist and, work for a magazine. And I stood up there and I showed 3 pictures that I had taken from Honduras that summer. And I said, I want to use photography to tell what God is doing on the mission field. And the whole class just looked at me like, who are you? I was the only believer in my entire class. And so they were intrigued, like, what is this all about? Like, who are you all about? When I graduated from photography school, my class said to me, you're the one in the class that we think will be in National Geographic within the next 10 years. I looked at them, I said, you guys are crazy. That's never going to happen. I haven't been in National Geographic, and it's been longer than 10 years, but God had something different planned. That photography led me to where my heart wanted to be, to Africa. And in order to get there, I didn't just move straight to Africa. I had to take little steps of faith. Maybe it was the first trip was going away to Honduras for a week or 2. And then it was going to Brazil for a few weeks. And then just growing that. And pretty soon I said, I need to move across the state. I need to know what it feels like to be away from my family. And those little steps of faith that I took continued to grow to a point where I could move to Liberia. I wanted to tell the real story of what was going on the mission field. And so then that led me to Samaritan's Purse. We're an international relief organization, and so a lot of us, everyone knows us by the Operation Christmas Child shoeboxes, which is an awesome ministry that we do. But it's just one part of the ministry that we do. And so when there's a disaster around the world, when there's a war, when there's famine, when there's an outbreak of disease, when there's a hurricane, earthquake, Samaritan's Purse goes in with relief supplies to help those in need. Our goal is to reduce suffering and to save lives of the people who have been affected by that. And so I've been working with Samaritan's Purse for 10 years now, and everything that I've done a lot of different jobs with Samaritan's Purse, but I've always kept photography in my job description. And so I've been able to tell that story of what God is doing. And so I want to share 2 experiences that I've had through this job. And let me tell you, it is the best job in the whole entire world. A lot of people call me a missionary, but I don't use that term. I wouldn't call myself a missionary. I would call myself more of a humanitarian worker that gets to share Jesus. I don't have to raise support. I'm paid to do this job. I am paid to be a part of incredible things around the world and to tell people about Jesus. And there's no greater job than that. And so this is just a common thing of what I do, is I take pictures, I gather stories so that people around the world can know what God is doing through Samaritan's Purse. And so one place that he took me was in South Sudan in 2011. I was asked to go and gather some testimonies of the refugees of the Nuba Mountains. So what was happening in Sudan is that the whole nation was just Sudan. And then it had split into North Sudan and South Sudan. And where the border was, no one was happy with it. The North didn't like the people who were in their area. The South wanted the area that they were in. And those were Christians that were stuck in the middle. And so the North Sudan government were attacking the Nuba Mountain people. And so it was my job to go to meet these people in the refugee camp just south of the border, to gather their stories so that the United States Congress could decide, should we intervene in this situation or not? And so I flew in on the Samaritan's Purse DC-3 plane. You fly in on this dirt airstrip, and you get in, and the refugee camp is about a 2.5-hour four-wheeler ride through a swamp. And I'm not talking about a few inches of water. I'm talking about 3 to 4 feet of water that we're driving four-wheelers through. And let me tell you this is something that I will always regret. I'm a farm girl. I grew up in Iowa. I grew up in Ironton. I grew up riding four-wheelers my entire life. I'm very comfortable on them. I got off the plane. I had all of my camera equipment. The guy who was to take me to the camp said, okay, we need somebody to drive the second four-wheeler. But the picture he was painting about how to get to this refugee camp and what it was going to take, I got intimidated. And I thought, I don't know if I can drive this four-wheeler with all of my camera equipment, keep it safe, keep it dry, and get to the refugee camp without ruining this four-wheeler, without getting stuck in the water. And so I sat in the back and I said, I'll let somebody else drive. And the girl who's never driven a four-wheeler, who grew up in the city, had never been in a situation like that, got on the four-wheeler and drove it through the swamp. And I thought, Joni, why did you let that opportunity pass? So lesson number 1, don't overestimate yourself, but don't underestimate yourself either. Don't underestimate the experience that you have and the background that you have that perfectly places you for what God has in front of you. So we made it to the refugee camp, and there were thousands of people who had been fleeing from this violence, tons of people who were needing food. And I spent the next 3 days talking with as many people as I could, listening to their testimonies of what had happened to them. Horrendous stories. I'm talking from sunrise to sunset of the most horrible stories you can imagine. Of teachers, because all of the parents had been killed, grabbing 40 of their students and hiding in the mountains, trying to protect them to save their lives. Of families coming over a hill and a helicopter coming over top and using its blades to cut everyone in half. These kind of stories were happening in South Sudan. Food. Because we were in a swamp, you couldn't get trucks through to reach the people. And so when you don't have trucks, you use airplanes. This is a food drop. So I was there for a food drop. This is a Samaritan's Purse plane loaded with food. We cleared an area, and the plane came and dropped the food. It was another moment where I didn't think I was going to make it out alive. I got a little bit too close and a little bit too excited taking pictures. And the pilot radioed down. He's like, I don't know who's down there in a white T-shirt, but they better watch out. And it was true. It was a bag that landed about 15 feet away from me. And let me tell you, you don't want to get crushed by a 150-pound bag of rice that's been falling from 5,000 feet. So I thank God that He protected me on that. But this is a picture from inside the plane as they're getting ready to drop the food. So this was one situation in South Sudan that I never, ever anticipated being involved in. Another situation that God brought me to, that through everything that had happened in between, was perfectly preparing me and our team for. And this was the Ebola outbreak in 2014 in Liberia. God placed us as an organization, whether we liked it or not, perfectly in the center of this horrendous outbreak. We call this the Big E, is how we refer to it in our team, Ebola. The scary thing about Ebola is that you couldn't see it, you couldn't hear it, you didn't know which direction it was coming from, you didn't know who around you had it, and you didn't know. It was one of the scariest things of my entire life. What was so scary about it is that if you had contact with someone or the bodily fluids of someone who was Ebola positive, there was a gestation period of 2 to 21 days that you could have no symptoms. For 21 days, and all of a sudden, day 21, you come down with the symptoms. And so what happens is, as the numbers around us were increasing and more people were getting sick and more people were dying, you are thinking through your mind of every move you have made for the last 21 days. Everything you have touched. Am I going to get sick? Am I next? What's going to happen? Everything was spiraling out of control. We ended up being one of only 2 organizations in the world that was responding to the Ebola outbreak. Doctors Without Borders was the only organization in the world that had experience responding to Ebola. And they were begging for help. Nobody answered, except for Samaritan's Purse. We said, these are our family members. These are our friends. How can we not respond to what is going on around us? And so we ended up responding clinically, which means we were running treatment units. We were taking people in, treating them as much as possible, taking care of their bodies if they passed away, celebrating with them if they survived. And as you know, with Ebola, you can't expose any part of your body to the bodily fluid. And so you have on this personal protective equipment. You have on boots, you've got on a suit, you've got on an apron over that, you've got a hood, you've got 2 masks over your mouth, you've got goggles, and it's not air conditioned like this nice auditorium is. It's 100 degrees plus, and you're wearing a plastic suit with 3 or 4 pair of gloves on your hands for hours at a time because the need was so great. You just needed to do what you needed to do. And there were very strict protocols about how to get dressed and how to get undressed. And chlorine, as simple as chlorine is what kills the virus. And so you can imagine how much chlorine we were spraying absolutely everything. I'd go home at night, I'd wash my hands before I go into the house. I'd come into the house, anything I'd touch, I'd go back and I'd clean it with Clorox. Because you were just so paranoid. Is the virus in here? Am I next? Am I going to get sick? Pretty soon we started not eating. We started not sleeping because you're just so consumed about what is going on. The days were long, incredibly stressful. Here's another picture from inside the unit up in Foya, which we ran that unit for a number of months. It was incredibly hard and incredibly heartbreaking. The first 45 patients that we had 1 survivor. 1 survivor out of 45. People were not believing that Ebola was real. They thought it was a government conspiracy. They thought the government was saying this so that more international aid could come into the country. They didn't believe it. And so when they did come to the unit, they would come too late, and there was nothing we could do about it. We had been working weeks on end, days on end, and I was completely exhausted. My boss said to me, you need to take a day off. You need to rest. So Saturday was my day off. 8:30 in the morning, I get a phone call from my good friend saying, half of the staff didn't show up this morning. They're too afraid. Their families are giving them a hard time. We are so understaffed. So I went to the unit, and I spent the day putting chlorine sprayers together and running around getting supplies for the medical staff that were going inside. This is William. This is the first survivor that we had of the first 45 patients. We were very, very thankful that this little boy survived. You know, my desire since I was a young girl was to be able to tell the real story of what was going on in the mission field. And in South Sudan and in Liberia, God allowed that to happen. I don't know if you recognize this guy, but this is Dr. Kent Brantley, the first American to contract Ebola and the first American to be brought back on U.S. soil Ebola positive. And Dr. Brantley was my colleague. He's my friend. And in the middle of this crazy outbreak, he got sick. And when I heard he was sick, I thought, you know, he's probably just worn down. He has been working around the clock for days on end. After he works in the unit, he would go back to the hospital and help do rounds at the hospital. I'm sure he's just tired. But there was one particular day I was like, you know, I think a story on Kent Brantley would be a good idea for our organization. So I spent the day photographing Kent, following him around, watching how he was working inside the unit, watching how he interacted with the patients, always with love and gentleness. Never in haste, never in a hurry, always moving very slowly. The numbers continued to rise. Kent got sick, my friend Nancy Wrightball got sick, and we didn't know what was going on. We were literally walking through the valley of the shadow of death. And so the Lord used my photography skills to tell the story, both to try and do as much as I could to get the Liberian people to understand that this disease is real and they need to take it seriously and do the proper precautions so their family themselves don't get sick. And he used it to try and get the attention of the international community that was sitting idly by. No one was stepping forward. We were able to get an experimental drug to help Kent and Nancy, and it saved their lives. But pretty soon the numbers became too dangerous for our team to be in Liberia anymore, and our organization told us that we had to leave. I don't know if any of you have ever seen the movie Argo, but they have to leave the country in a clandestine way. That's exactly how we had to leave Liberia, because nobody wanted us. It was really interesting to me. There's 3 things I'll never forget. Number 1 is arriving into the Sioux Falls airport and seeing my family after this. The second one is that there was a disease going on in West Africa called Ebola. There is a disease going on in America called Fearbola. And the way people were reacting to those who were trying to stop the outbreak was very discouraging. I couldn't watch the news. I couldn't read social media. I just got so angry and so frustrated at the lack of empathy for the people who were suffering. Not understanding that the people who were responding to the outbreak in Liberia were actually stopping it from coming to America. That concept just wasn't there. And the third thing I'll never forget is that first Sunday walking into my home church, Hayward Christian Reformed Church, not knowing how people were going to react. And all the women of the church just came over and hugged me immediately. They weren't afraid to touch me. They weren't afraid to hug me. It was amazing. But what good could come from this situation? Well, a number of things have. There has since then been a brand new vaccine for Ebola. And so right now there's a large outbreak happening in the DRC, and this vaccine has been key in controlling that. It's still not far from over. There are now 5 experimental treatments for Ebola, which there was no treatment before. It has strengthened the health sector of Liberia, and it has opened the door to counseling, to trauma counseling, to the Liberians who have gone through a lot. We have learned through this that even though Ebola was incredibly traumatic, there's so many layers of trauma from the civil crisis that God needs to heal. And so God does bring beauty through ashes. If you're interested, we were able to produce a full-length documentary of the outbreak called Facing Darkness. But these are the things that I want you to walk away with today. If I could sit here and talk to myself 20 years ago, this is what I would say. Don't be afraid to step out in faith. There's going to be some scary things ahead of you. There already are some scary things in front of you. But you need to make sure that your faith is greater than the fear. I love roller coasters. I don't know if you like roller coasters, but I think there's various people who go on the roller coaster. Some want to sit in that front row and experience everything, the highs, the lows, the fear, the anxiety, the joy, and some want to sit in that back row and just be along for the ride. What I want to say to you this morning is don't waste your life. You've got your whole life in front of you. Things that you can't even imagine that God has planned for you. Don't waste it. When you meet God face to face, He is not going to say to you, "So, Joni, did you have a comfortable life? Did you have a nice, large house filled with all the things you wanted? Did you have the newest car? Did you have a lot of money in your bank account? Did you make a name for yourself?" He is not going to ask me that. Those things don't matter. He is going to ask me, "Joni, did you love me? Do you love me?" I'll say, "Yeah." He'll say, "Really? Do you love me?" That's what he's going to ask. And if you love him, you will love other people. Sometimes I think it's so easy for us to go through the motions, to check a box. Went to church on Sunday, check. Went to youth group Wednesday night, check. Went to living groups, check. Are we just going through the motions? I don't want you to miss out on God's amazing intention through the church, through you as a part of the church. God's intention to use the church as his tool to complete his mission on earth to restore everything, the world and ourselves, to his original perfect design. There's not going to be any Ebola. There's not going to be any fighting in Sudan. There's not going to be any sickness. That's his original perfect design. Love God and love others. You have your whole life in front of you. Don't waste it. I challenge you, sit in that front row of that roller coaster. There'll be times that you'll be squealing with joy. There'll be times that you'll be afraid. There'll be a lot of loops in between. But it's an incredible ride when you step out in faith. Thank you.